The envelope was already half open when Grant Whitaker realized his hands were shaking. Scotch tape lifted in a ragged curl, and the moon sticker a child had pressed on the flap clung to his thumb like it didn't want to let go. In the silence of the 39th floor, air vents whispering, skyline humming like cold electricity, he could hear the paper breathe. Shaky pencil letters, uneven and urgent, stared up from the front. "Please, can you read this? It's very important." He didn't move, because the next inch would decide who he was, another executive who delegated feelings to an assistant, or a man who would let a stranger's small voice reroute the night. The city pressed its face to the glass behind him, Chicago in midnight chrome, sirens distant, Lake Michigan a darker stripe of black. He slid the letter onto the blotter, placed both palms on either side, and leaned in as if the desk were an operating table and he was either about to heal something or ruin it. The first tear in the tape made a sound too loud for the room. He stopped. He swallowed. He remembered the last time handwriting like this had made him feel small, a school paper taped crooked on a refrigerator, block letters, the S backwards, a star drawn too heavy in the corner. He blinked hard until office lights replaced kitchen lights and lemon polish replaced the smell of spaghetti. The letter waited. It did not apologize for being here. He slid a finger under the flap and lifted. The tape peeled, then released. Paper gave. The envelope opened like a held breath. He tilted it and a single folded page slid into his palm, thin, soft at the edges where a small thumb had worried it all day before courage won. Pencil ghosted the fold in gray. He unfolded once. "Dear Mr. Boss of the big building." His throat clicked. No company name. No brand. No pitch deck. Just a 7-year-old's guess at how power works. "Please don't throw away. It's very important." Grant set the page down before the tremor in his fingers could bruise the graphite. His left hand found the desk edge and tightened as if the room might tilt. He waited for the confident voice he used on earnings calls to arrive and narrate him into safety. It didn't. Only the rain arrived, soft on the glass, then heavier, like someone knocking from the wrong side of a window. He read the next line. "My name is Amira and I am 7. We have a playground with a yellow slide but it is broken and the swing has no chain on one side. My brother says when I feel better I will fly." The word brother pulled a wire through him. The office blurred, the star on the refrigerator flashed, a hospital corridor pressed into the back of his eyes. He kept reading because stopping felt like the smaller sin and he'd already paid too much to smaller sins. He could hear the scratch of the pencil and the way the word sat, hesitant, brave, wrong in places and right in the way that matters. A tiny drawing leaned in the margin, a lopsided slide, 2 stick figures, one circle head filled and darker than the other, like a moon in eclipse. "Please can you help fix it so he can play one time before he gets too tired? My mommy says this is not how the world works but my teacher says letters can make a thing real if you write it right." Something hot landed on the page and clouded the line. He lifted his thumb too late and smudged the E in help. He closed his eyes, breathed in for 5, out for 7, the rhythm the company doctor taught him after the board fight that left his wrists buzzing for an hour. He opened his eyes and kept going. "I promise I will pick up trash and not push. I only want it strong. If you can't, please write back and tell me no, so I can tell my brother a story that doesn't hurt." His chest folded. The request wasn't for money. It wasn't even for hope. It was for honesty that wouldn't break a child. If you've ever held a plea like this and felt your armor crack, subscribe now, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because the next decision he makes will either turn this letter into a miracle or another reason a kid stops believing grown-ups. He turned the page over. On the back, a little square with a triangle roof and an arrow pointing to a window labeled me. The pencil had dented the paper there, as if she'd pressed harder to make sure he could see her. He set the letter on the blotter and stared at the phone. He could call his chief of staff and say, "Find the girl, fix the slide, send a photographer." He could CC legal and CSR and comms and watch as a clean memo turned a messy ache into a tidy story. He could wire money and think that's what it costs to not feel helpless. He pressed his thumb to the moon sticker instead. The adhesive still had life. It clung to his skin. He peeled it off, stuck it back to the envelope, peeled it off again, testing whether it wanted to stay or go. The sticker held on. Some small things do. He stood. The carpet drank the sound of his steps as he crossed to the window. Far below, a city truck sprayed a fan of water that turned streetlights into halos. His reflection looked like a man who knew how to move markets and not how to move one chain on a swing. The glass was cold. He put his forehead to it anyway. He came back to the desk and picked up the page as if it were a wafer and he were a lapsed believer trying faith on again. He read the first line again, "Please don't throw away. It's very important." He had thrown away other things, apologies that came late, time he could not buy back, stories he should have said yes to when there was still a chance to end them well. He would not add this to that pile. Not tonight. He opened his email. A blank message looked back with all the indifference of a white wall. He closed it. He didn't want to start with a memo. He wanted his hands on the chain. He wanted to look a child in the eye and say the word yes in a way that would hold if the wind rose. The elevator dinged. No footsteps, just the bell. The building breathed out. He slid the letter back into the envelope, lined up the edges like a paramedic aligning a splint, and pressed the moon flat until it sat like a seal again. He left the blotter open, no reason to pretend this hadn't cut him. If you've ever wished the person with the power would show up in person, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Because he's about to decide whether he's a title or a man, and what's on the other end of this letter is a 7-year-old who can't wait for a committee. He stood, grabbed his coat without putting it on, killed the desk lamp, and let the city light carry the room. He took 2 steps toward the door, stopped, returned, and lifted the envelope one more time. His thumb hovered over the fold he hadn't opened, the little corner still sealed where one more line waited. He didn't know why he'd left it. Maybe to keep a piece of not knowing safe for one more minute. The hallway beyond was a long answer waiting to be read. The elevator, a steel mouth ready to swallow a man into action. He placed the envelope in his inside pocket, felt the small pressure against his ribs, and finally opened the door. He stepped out. Then a sound stopped him, the paper inside settling, or his heart, or the building. He couldn't tell. He reached back, slid the envelope out, and turned down the last unbroken corner. The tape gave with a soft sigh. The flap lifted. A final line, penciled faint and careful, leaned across the bottom margin like a secret meant only for the one who finished. P.S. If you come, can you knock soft because my brother sleeps a lot. He stood there in the doorway, hand on the knob, eyes stinging, the city's breath on his face. The elevator bell chimed again. He didn't move. He closed the envelope, pressed the moon tight, and walked into the hall without turning off the light. The cough started again before dawn. Amira pressed her palm gently to her brother's chest and counted each rise. His breaths came shallow, stubborn, like a boy fighting in his sleep against a weight too heavy for his 7-year-old ribs. The radiator groaned but gave little warmth. Frost-shaped fern patterns across the thin glass of their bedroom window, and outside the street lamp flickered like it was tired of keeping watch. She sat upright on the mattress, clutching the blanket tighter around him. The letter was gone now, carried in the pocket of a mail truck, maybe stacked with bills and catalogs, maybe already lost. But she believed, had to believe, that it was moving. Her shoes waited by the door, the toes scuffed, laces mismatched. She slipped them on quietly. Her mother was already at work, cleaning offices before the sun rose. That left Amira to watch over her brother until school. She pulled her jacket tight, kissed his forehead, and whispered a promise. "I'll tell you what the sky looked like when you wake up." She stepped out into the hallway, down the narrow stairs that smelled of dust and boiled cabbage from the neighbor below. Outside, the morning air bit at her face. The city was awake but not yet alive, delivery vans unloading bread, buses sighing at corners, shopkeepers dragging metal gates upward. Her path bent toward the schoolyard. She walked slowly, kicking a bottle cap, because the sight waiting for her always slowed her steps. The playground. Once, it had been her brother's favorite place, the yellow slide shining, the swings creaking like music, the seesaw balanced like a boat at sea. Now the slide's middle was cracked, sharp edges wrapped with caution tape that peeled in the wind. One of the swing chains dangled loose, the seat tilted to the ground. The seesaw leaned sideways, one handle missing. Amira stood at the fence, small fingers curled around the cold metal. The letter had carried these images away in her crooked writing. She had begged the boss of the big building to fix it, not for herself but for the boy asleep in their shared bed who still believed he would fly. Her breath clouded in front of her. For a moment she closed her eyes and imagined the chains restored, the slide whole, her brother running with his arms outstretched. She held that picture because the real one hurt. If you've ever looked at something broken and wished someone with power would finally see you, subscribe now, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because little Amira is standing at a fence believing her letter can cross a city no one else believes in. The bell rang. Children flooded the yard, racing past her. Amira walked inside slowly, her notebook pressed to her chest. She kept her eyes on the linoleum, ignoring the laughter. At her desk, she traced the word important again, the one her teacher had helped her spell, practicing each letter until the pencil tore a hole in the page. By afternoon, her brother's cough weighed heavier in her mind. She asked the teacher if she could take home extra worksheets, because sometimes he liked to sit with her and pretend he was in school too. The teacher smiled, not knowing the reason behind the request, and slipped her a stack. The walk home was longer. The clouds sagged low, and wind pushed grit against her cheeks. She hurried up the stairwell 2 steps at a time, heart thudding, until she reached the apartment door. Inside, the room was dim. Her brother slept still, lips parted, breath shallow. She set the papers down and touched his shoulder. He stirred but didn't wake. Amira sat at the window, knees drawn to her chest. From here, she could see the playground's crooked frame at the edge of the block. Rust glimmered under the weak sun. She rested her chin on her knees and whispered, "Please let him swing just one more time." If your heart tightens hearing a child pray for something so small, so ordinary, then subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because for her, it's not ordinary at all. It's everything. The hours stretched. Evening lights flicked on in apartment windows like stars appearing one by one. Her mother returned, face drawn, hands raw from bleach water. She kissed both children softly and cooked noodles with sauce thinned by water, dividing it into 3 bowls. Amira ate slowly, watching her brother push the noodles around without appetite. After dinner, she gathered the bowls, rinsed them in cold water, and stacked them carefully. She wanted no noise, nothing to disturb his fragile sleep. When her mother dozed in the chair, Amira returned to the window. The street outside was mostly empty. A stray dog nosed at a trash bag. A man pulled his coat tighter as he passed under the flickering lamp. And then, headlights turned the corner. Not the rattle of a bus or the grind of a delivery van. Smooth, steady, deliberate. A black car slid onto the street, polished as if it carried the night on its surface. It slowed at the corner, engine humming low, and then rolled forward toward their building. Amira's breath caught. She pressed her forehead to the glass. The car paused at the hydrant, its engine purring, windows tinted too dark to see inside. She froze, small hand gripping the sill so tight her knuckles paled. The car didn't leave. It waited. If you've ever watched something powerful stop in front of the smallest place you live, and wondered if it came for you, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because Amira doesn't know yet that her letter has reached the one man who can change everything. Down the hall, her brother coughed again. Her mother stirred but didn't wake. Amira stayed at the window, eyes locked on the black car, until the taillights flared red. The car pulled away, slow and certain, disappearing back into the city's arteries. She exhaled, realizing she'd been holding her breath. Relief came tangled with fear. Why stop here? Why tonight? She turned from the window, hugged her knees, and whispered to the quiet room, "Please, let it be because of the letter." And outside, far away, in an office high above the city, a man carried her envelope pressed to his chest like it was the only compass left. The second night fell like a weight over the narrow block, pressing silence into the walls of the Brooks apartment. Amira curled up on the couch beside Micah, who had finally drifted to sleep after another coughing fit. Tasha rinsed dishes in the kitchen sink, the clatter dulled by exhaustion, while Evelyn sat in her armchair knitting by the dim lamp. And then it came, the same sound Amira had prayed not to hear again. The low growl of an engine easing up to the curb. Smooth. Controlled. Not like delivery vans that stutter and cough. This car purred with certainty. Amira stiffened, clutching Micah's thin wrist. Her eyes darted to the window, but she didn't move. She didn't have to. She already knew. The car door opened, deliberate and unhurried. Polished shoes touched the cracked pavement outside. Heavy steps climbed the stairwell, each one louder than it should have been. Evelyn set her knitting down, needles crossed, eyes fixed on the door. Tasha dried her hands on a towel, jaw tightening. Then the knock. One measured strike. Not rushed. Not polite. It wasn't asking permission. It was announcing presence. If you've ever felt a single knock change the air inside your home, subscribe now, and tell us where you're watching from. Because for this family, that knock meant the letter Amira had written had found its way back to their door. Evelyn rose first, though her knees protested. She pressed her palm flat against the wood as though she could read the man's intent through it. "Who's there?" she demanded. The reply was steady, almost too calm. "A message." Tasha stepped closer, slipping past her mother. "From who?" "A man who doesn't throw away words," the voice said. Tasha hesitated, then slid the chain back. She opened the door only as wide as her hand. A tall man stood in the hallway, coat collar turned up, face shadowed under the stairwell bulb. He didn't push forward. Instead, he extended a folded envelope sealed with dark red wax. "For the girl," he said. "She's a child," Evelyn snapped. The man's gaze didn't waver. "Children sometimes move mountains when grown men refuse to." His words hung heavy. Then, without another sound, he tipped his head, turned, and descended the stairs. The black car door At school, the day dragged. She couldn't focus on her lessons, not when the envelope weighed heavier than her textbooks. Every tick of the clock reminded her that words were waiting, sealed in wax, holding answers she both longed for and feared. When the final bell rang, Amira ran home, her breath fogging in the cool air. She burst through the door, dropping her bag on the floor. Tasha and Evelyn exchanged weary glances, but said nothing. They knew. Amira pulled out the envelope, her small fingers fumbling with the seal. The wax cracked cleanly. She unfolded the heavy paper, eyes wide. The handwriting inside was neat, deliberate. "Dear Amira, I read your letter. I didn't throw it away. It mattered." Amira's lips moved silently as she read, her chest rising and falling faster. Evelyn leaned closer. Tasha hovered at her shoulder. "I saw the playground you wrote about. I saw the broken chain, the cracked slide, and I thought of my own childhood. I thought of what it means when children have to sit on the sidelines while others play." Her breath caught. She kept reading. "Tomorrow, workers will arrive. They will not carry cameras. They will not ask questions. They will only repair what was broken. And when the work is done, I would like to meet you. Not for a headline. For the truth." At the bottom, signed in thick black ink, Grant Whitaker. The name meant nothing to Amira, but Evelyn gasped softly. She had read the business pages often enough to know who Grant was, the CEO of Whitaker Holdings, a man whose name moved entire markets. Amira's hands shook as she folded the letter again. She couldn't imagine why someone like him would answer a little girl from a broken block. She looked up at her grandmother, her mother, her brother lying frail on the couch. The room felt different now. Like the world outside their window had bent, ever so slightly, toward them. If you've ever seen Hope Arrive written in your name, subscribe now, and tell us where you're watching from. Because tomorrow, Amira would discover if powerful promises could keep their word. The letter lay on the table between them, heavy as truth. Evelyn whispered what all of them were already thinking. "Child, you've been noticed." Morning arrived without promises, a thin gray light that flattened edges and kept secrets. Yet by the time Amira tied her laces and helped Micah into his jacket, the block had already gathered a new sound, an intent, clean clang that didn't belong to buses or garbage trucks or the tired shuffle of commuting feet. Down at the corner, the playground had drawn workers the way a wound draws bandages. 2 trucks idled low. Men in plain vests unloaded crates, lengths of steel, new chain coiled like bright river water. No banners. No logos. Just movement that meant to stay until something was right. Evelyn watched from the stoop with her arms folded, skepticism guarding the doorway out of habit. Tasha stepped to the curb and took in the careful spreading of tarps, the measured lift of the yellow slide onto its side, the way tools were passed hand to hand with the unspoken rhythm of people who fix things for a living. Amira stood at the chain-link fence and wrapped her fingers into its cold diamonds until her knuckles paled. She didn't call out. She didn't wave. She didn't dare offer the moment any attention it might misunderstand. The old swing frame groaned as bolts surrendered to torque and time. Rust powder ticked into a pail. A cutting wheel whined, sparks snapped once, twice, then fell quiet as the worker eased his pressure and replaced it with something more precise. A second team inventoried new parts, bags of fasteners, a blister-wrapped stack of seats that still smelled faintly of warm rubber and factory dust, neatly labeled lengths of chain. Nothing cheap. Nothing showy. Not charity dressed for cameras, just work dressed for results. Wind slid along the fence and lifted wisps of Amira's hair. She could taste metal in the air, and oil, and the faint sweetness of a nearby deli opening its morning bread. Behind her, Micah's breath came small and deliberate, each inhale a minor victory he counted without counting. When the first section of the old frame came free, a worker steadied it with both hands, then carried it away like a tired shoulder finally allowed to rest. If you've ever wondered whether the smallest voice can change a city that wasn't listening, subscribe now. Because what's happening here is quiet and exact, the sound of promise turning into bolts and balance. Hours arranged themselves into progress. The yellow slide's belly, the cracked section that had taught children to detour and doubt, was cut out, edges cleaned, a replacement ribbed panel lowered into place and stitched back by welds that hissed, cooled, and held. A brush-worked primer into scraped metal, a roller followed with yellow so faithful it seemed to remember the color it used to be. The swing's top rail, pitted and bent, left in sections on a tarp. A new crossbar climbed where the old one had been, its galvanization catching a thin sun through high cloud. The neighborhood collected along the fence as if drawn there by a hum only certain kinds of hope can make. Kids counted tools out loud and lost track and started again. Parents stood with coffee in paper cups and did not ask questions with their mouths because their eyes had so many of them. A man with a lunch pail stopped and set it on the hood of his car and forgot to open it. A woman on her way to the bus lingered until she missed 2 in a row and finally texted something that was probably the truth: "I'll be late for a good reason." Amira didn't move from the fence except to let a smaller child slide into the gap she'd made and peek through. When she shifted, she slipped a hand back to Micah's sleeve and felt the thinness of him under the fabric. He was steady now, standing, eyes wide, mouth parted the way kids' mouths open when a magician's hand pulls something unexpected from the empty air. That's what this felt like, an ordinary magic she had paid for in pencil and breath. Evelyn came to stand behind them, not to interfere, just to witness. She had seen posters and fundraisers and the way help sometimes wore a costume. This didn't. This looked like a decision that had already gone through every meeting it needed to and arrived at the only signature that mattered, the one on a work order no one else would see. By midday, the new crossbar sat straight and true. The chain arrived in bright loops. A worker ran it through the eyelets with a sure wrist, then checked the link count left to right, equal again. He tested the seats with the weight of his hand, then his knee, then his full frame, letting the chain bite and stretch and settle into the angle where force becomes swing and swing becomes flight. The slide cured in pale light until a gloved finger pressed and the paint refused to give. Children drifted away and returned with snacks, with siblings, with stories about how they'd once jumped at the bottom and burned their palms, about how they'd learned to drag their sneakers to slow down, about the time somebody's uncle pushed too hard and somebody else's laugh fell into crying and then back into laughing again. The place had a memory and, for the first time in a long time, the memory wasn't being written only in past tense. Amira's stomach found hunger around the same moment the first truck killed its engine. Tasha placed a cracker in her hand without looking, as if the body could be fed while the heart did its work. Micah leaned against her hip and pointed, not a wild point, a careful one, to the chain, to the first seat hanging straight and even. His cheeks showed a color that had been missing most of the winter. A foreman in a plain cap walked the perimeter once, doing the kind of inspection only people who take pride in invisible things know how to perform. He touched welds, tightened a nut a quarter turn with his fingers, nudged a support shoe until it seated flush, dragged his boot heel along a trip edge and then rubbed the burr out with a file. None of it for show. All of it for later. If this is pressing at your chest too, the creak that's about to return, the simple sound the world makes when it works, subscribe now. Because this is the exact point where tenderness becomes infrastructure. By late afternoon the tarps were folded, the scraps stacked, the paint cans nested, the tools counted back into their cases with the quick choreography of people who have more stops to make. A worker stepped back and let his eyes travel the shape of what they'd done. He looked satisfied the way you get when a level bubble centers itself without being asked twice. A gesture at the fence, a nod, 2 words that were more invitation than announcement, go ahead. The gate swung open with the small complaint of hinges that hadn't been asked to be generous in a while. Kids poured through, careful at first, then brave, and spread themselves across the remade landscape like water finding all the low places. The first run up the steps toward the yellow slide came with an instinctive pause at the crack that wasn't there anymore, a toe tested, a heel pressed, a body committed, and then a streak of motion that translated gravity back into joy. A girl who always used the swings as a chair because she didn't trust the missing chain let herself grip both sides and sit straight and lean. The first creak arrived, new metal speaking its one old word, and laughter answered it in a language kids keep even when adults forget. Amira didn't run. She stood and watched the place take its first deep breath. Then she turned to Micah and tilted her head toward the swings. He nodded. His steps were small and precise the way convalescence teaches you to move, but they were his. She placed him in the seat and closed her hands around the chain just below his. The links were cool and slightly greasy from gloved hands, they gave her palm a faint smell of iron and machine. She eased him back and forward, listening for what his lungs would say about it, calculating in a way 7-year-olds shouldn't have to but sometimes do. The swing found a rhythm. Micah's smile arrived as if it had been left here months ago and was waiting for the exact combination of steel and breath to bring it back. He didn't shout. He didn't waste air. He just let the corners of his mouth lift and his eyes brighten to the degree they could manage, and that was plenty. On the next seat, Amira sat and pumped once, twice, then matched her brother's cadence so their shadows stretched and returned in tandem, a metronome that counted neither fear nor time. Evelyn wiped at her eyes when she thought no one was looking and then scowled at herself for the indulgence. Tasha stood with her hands tucked into her sleeves and her shoulders dropped in a way they hadn't all year. The block sounded different. It sounded like it remembered childhood as something accessible, not a rumor. Workers slid their toolboxes into beds and shut tailgates with the soft finality of well-fitted things. No one asked for a photograph. No one offered a card. They lifted 2 fingers in a small salute to the people at the fence and drove away without writing their names on anything the neighborhood would have to stare at later. Evening peeled the day into warmer tones. Sodium streetlights blinked on, turned the slide honey-colored, the chain almost copper. Breath showed again. Coats zipped. Parents began to claim children with practiced calls and a patience that had room in it for one more push, one more trip down, one more upside-down hang from knees. The stamp of feet, the drag of boots, the quiet negotiations of departure, these ordinary noises wore their Sunday best version and no one complained. Amira and Micah slowed their swings to stillness. She hopped down and steadied him as he slid off the seat and stood. He was a little pink, a little winded, a lot alive. They walked the perimeter together and touched the slide where it had been weak, and it did not yield. They touched the rung that used to wobble and it did not. They touched a bolt head and it returned the cold of metal and nothing else, no promise to break again, no memory of failing. The block's traffic thinned. The deli flipped its sign to closed. A train sighed somewhere far enough away to sound like weather. Amira turned toward the street and felt the new quiet discover them. That's when the car came, the black one whose shape she recognized the way she recognized her own handwriting. It didn't approach like a menace, it arrived like a period at the end of a sentence that had been trying to end well all day. The rear door opened. A man in a gray suit stepped out. No entourage. No coat over his shoulders despite the cold, as if a body disciplined by years of boardrooms had learned to ignore certain discomforts. He didn't cross the fence or call out. He stood at the corner and absorbed the scene without touching it. The playground didn't falter under his gaze. It had already learned its new shape. Grant Whitaker watched the swing chains spark small halos at their pivot points. He watched the slide receive another pair of sneakers and another and not complain. He watched Amira steady Micah with a hand that understood how much to ask from a chest and when to give it back. The expression he wore wasn't pride or guilt, it was something that looked like attention finally doing the job it was made for. Amira saw him and knew. Not from photos, she'd never seen one, but from the way presence sometimes has a name even before you say it. She didn't wave. She didn't run. She let him witness what he had put in motion without asking to be thanked for it. He seemed to prefer that. Tasha noticed next and said nothing. Evelyn followed her gaze, evaluated the man the way a grandmother weighs interference against intention, and did not move either. The block itself seemed to consider him and decide to keep doing what it was doing. Grant stayed until the last seat hung empty and the last child left a shoe print on the landing of the slide and the last small laugh lapped at the edge of the cold. Then he took a step toward the gate and stopped, as if something about crossing thresholds tonight would be the wrong first verb. He adjusted nothing, tie, cuff, coat, and still managed to make adjustment the posture of the moment. He looked once more at the swing set, at the chain whose absence had started this, at the metal now doing exactly what metal is supposed to do when a child asks it to participate in joy. When he turned, the car accepted him without argument. The door closed with the soft finality of money well spent and not spoken about. The engine gathered itself, the tires rolled, the street took the weight and gave it back, and the corner resumed its old shape with one new memory welded into it. Amira stood very still. Under her skin, something rewrote the terms the world had offered her so far. The paper she'd pushed into a mailbox had routed labor through rooms she would never enter and delivered the result to a fence she could reach. Tomorrow would bring the harder part, talking, choosing, letting strangers into sentences that used to be only hers. But tonight, the proof stood where there had been a problem, and the proof didn't need language. She took Micah's hand and they walked home together, their shoes whispering on sand the workers had raked smooth under the swings. The block watched them pass the way a house watches when its windows are lit from inside, quietly, with relief. Behind them, the chains moved a little in the wind and then came to rest, even, ready, waiting for morning. Evening gathered slow, folding the street into a hushed kind of suspense. The repaired playground sat quiet now, its chains motionless, its slide cooling to shadow. Children had gone in for dinner, only the memory of laughter lingered in the metal. But in the apartment across the street, silence pressed heavier than usual. Amira sat near Micah, fingers worrying the edge of her dress, while Tasha moved restlessly between kitchen and window, pretending to tidy what had already been tidied. Evelyn didn't move at all, she sat with her cane across her knees, eyes fixed on the door like she could already hear something coming. When the knock came, it wasn't frantic, and it wasn't soft. It carried weight, the kind that asks for more than entry. Micah startled, coughing once, clutching Amira's sleeve. The air thickened with recognition before anyone admitted it. If you've ever felt how one sound at the door could change your entire life, subscribe now, because this story is only going deeper. Tasha opened the door halfway, chain still drawn, her voice guarded. A man stood in the hall, tall, composed, the faint scent of rain on his coat though the sky had been dry all evening. Grant Whitaker. The figure Amira had seen at the playground's edge. His eyes weren't searching for introductions, they were fixed, clear, like someone already knew why he'd come. The chain slid back. The door opened. Grant stepped inside with quiet authority, not looking around the room for comfort, not filling the space with empty pleasantries. He carried only a slim folder in his left hand and a weight in his silence that turned every gaze toward him. Amira's breath caught, her small frame stiff beside her brother. He looked bigger than she'd imagined, larger than the man she pictured when she pressed pencil to paper and wrote "Dear Boss" of the big building. Yet he didn't seem unreachable. He seemed burdened, like someone already holding a letter in his chest that matched hers. "I came," he said simply, his voice steady but low, as though the walls might keep his words where they belonged. He looked at Evelyn first, granting her the respect of age, then at Tasha, then finally at Amira. "And I read every word." No one answered. Silence settled again, broken only by the uneven tick of the kitchen clock. Evelyn finally tapped her cane once, a signal, an invitation. Amira lifted her chin, lips trembling, but she didn't drop her gaze. Grant crouched, lowering himself until his eyes met hers at the level of her chair. The folder stayed under his arm. He spoke slowly. "Do you still believe words can build something, Amira?" Her throat tightened, but she nodded. "Yes." For the first time since stepping through the door, something in his face shifted. Not a smile, not relief, something heavier, a recognition. He drew the folder free and set it on the table without opening it. His hand lingered on the cover a second longer than it should have, like it weighed more than paper. "Your letter did what no boardroom speech ever could," he said. "It reminded me who I answer to. Not shareholders. Not headlines. But people who can't afford to be invisible." Amira's heart raced. Tasha covered her mouth, eyes shining though no tears fell. Evelyn shifted, her posture straightening, suspicion giving way to a grudging respect she hadn't offered in years. "If I act," Grant continued, "it won't be for cameras. It won't be charity they can measure in a ledger. It will be because you believed someone would listen." He reached into his coat and produced a small envelope, this one marked with Amira's name in firm handwriting. He placed it on the table, next to the folder, and leaned back slowly, like he had placed a future he wasn't sure he deserved to carry. Amira's fingers itched to touch it, but she held back. "This isn't the end of what your letter started," Grant said, standing now, his presence filling the room differently. "It's the beginning." Evelyn's voice broke the silence. "And what's in that folder?" Grant's jaw tightened. His gaze lingered on her, then flicked back to Amira. "The truth. Some of it yours to hear tonight. Some of it mine to answer for tomorrow." He set his hand on the folder once more, then stepped away. "Read it carefully. Decide who you'll be when the sun comes up." No one moved as he crossed the room. His steps were steady, final. At the door, he paused, turning back to Amira one last time. His voice softened. "You gave me a letter. I'll give you a choice. Tomorrow, you'll know why." The latch clicked as the door shut behind him. Silence rushed back in like a tide. If you believe even the smallest voice deserves to be heard, subscribe now. Because what comes next will prove just how loud a child's words can echo. Amira reached for the envelope with both hands. Her name looked strange in that strong handwriting, as if it had grown older in a single day. She turned it once, twice, afraid to break the seal. Evelyn touched her shoulder gently. "Not tonight," the old woman murmured. "Let tomorrow arrive on its own." Amira set the envelope down beside the unopened folder. They sat there together, heavy as secrets, waiting for dawn. And outside, the black car idled at the curb longer than it should have, its headlights painting pale light on the walls before disappearing into the night. Morning found their table already set for reading rather than breakfast. The folder Grant Whitaker had left behind lay in the center like a quiet machine waiting to be switched on. Steam rose from 2 mugs that no one drank. The apartment held its breath the way rooms do when the next hour intends to rename them. Evelyn was the one who drew it closer. The cane leaned against her chair, her hands were careful, deliberate, the way a person handles old Bibles or breakable news. Tasha stood behind her, palms flat on the chair back, eyes on the spine. Amira perched on the edge of her seat, feet barely touching the floor, Micah tucked against her side with his blanket and a stubborn little courage that had learned to live inside small lungs. The paper fastener released with a thin metallic sigh. The first page rose. It wasn't a letter. It was a plan that had learned to write in bullet points and budgets. At the top, a title punched in black ink, Hawthorne Corridor Play and Safe Access Initiative, Phase 1, below, a grid of addresses and dates, a column labeled Liability Transfer with boxes already checked, a line that read Authorized by G. Whitaker and another that read Site Lead, Operations/Confidential. No signatures for show. Only the kind that move trucks. Evelyn didn't speak. She pressed her thumb to a number because it was too big to take in with eyes alone. Funds allocated for repairs, for inspections, for maintenance 6 months from now when cameras would be bored and gone if they ever came. The page said the work yesterday wasn't a single favor, but a first step in a line that stretched past sight. A photograph on the second page caught the light. The playground tilted slightly, mid-repair, a gloved hand holding a chain, the yellow slide braced on its side like an animal being tended. The angle wasn't meant to flatter. It was record-keeping, proof that someone who controls budgets had chosen to also control bolts. A stapled sheaf followed, dense with permits, city stamps, dates, a signature from a municipal clerk who probably didn't know who the request truly belonged to and didn't need to. An attached email printout skimmed past phrases Amira didn't understand: expedited variance, post-install audit, streetlight timing offset, and settled on one sentence that landed like a coin in a jar: community-led verification required, resident witness sign-off. Resident witness. The words widened the room around Amira's chair. If you've ever watched the truth arrive as paper that changes tomorrow, subscribe now. Because what's inside this folder weighs more than it looks, and some of it has a child's name written underneath. Tasha slid a page free, eyes scanning faster now that her fear had a direction to travel. This wasn't just about a swing set, the plan mapped corners and crosswalks, designated a day each month for inspections, listed a phone number that rang to a desk that wouldn't bounce them to a dead end. A page headed intake listed items that didn't belong to steal: aftercare for families, clinic vouchers, bus pass credits, school liaison. There, in black and white, the outline of help that understood the edges of their lives. Then the sheet that stilled the table: statement of intent. It had only 3 paragraphs, each shorter than the list that had come before. The language was plain, no corporate varnish coated it. The child's letter is the initiating cause. Repairs are not contingent on publicity or reciprocation. Site remains under community stewardship, support schedule attached. This action will not be used for marketing or reporting, internal ledger notes, non-billable/corrective. At the bottom, 2 signatures. One belonged to Grant Whitaker. There were photographs, more practical than pretty, a crew truck inventory, a row of new chain, a clipboard with check marks. But near the bottom of the stack, a different image, grainy, older, slid into view. A playground that was not theirs. A boy standing at a fence, shoulders set, chin lifted, a girl beside him laughing at something not visible. The caption under it, typed small, read, Southside, 89. Archive/personal. Grant as a child. No name said it. But the file had started to show its heart. If your chest tightens seeing a life's thread pulled from a stranger's past and tied to your block, subscribe now. Because what you're witnessing isn't charity, it's a ledger balancing where no one thought it kept score. Evelyn turned a page and stiffened. A memo had been wedged in, printed last, dated last night. Internal, holding statement, if necessary. The language wore a different jacket now. Should external interest arise, defer to Standard Line A, Community Partnership, Standard Line B, Ongoing Corporate Responsibility. Then a paragraph that didn't belong to any standard, under no circumstances will the child's name or image be shared. Any breach to be considered cause. Tasha's mouth softened by 1 degree. Limits. Lines someone else had already drawn so she wouldn't have to fight to draw them later. But the next page sobered her again, an email chain clipped into the corner. Names blacked out except the first initial and last name, R. Carrion, P. Duval, L. Horn. Sentences underlined automatically by the program, CSR scope creep, who authorized. Non-revenue exposure. Reminder, board review next quarter. Then Grant's reply at the bottom, 1 line, a carving instead of a sentence, authorized by me. Send concerns to my desk. It read like a door shut with a hand that knows how to close things for good. They read until sunlight found the bottom of the stack and the last page lay face down on the table. No tricks hid there. No signature demanded their gratitude. A schedule page waited meekly, dotted with dates for the next 6 months when people would return with wrenches instead of microphones. Only then did Tasha sit. She rubbed her hands together, working warmth into them the way you do when you've been standing too long at windows. She didn't say what she was thinking because saying it would have made it more fragile. That this was real. That someone rich had chosen to be particular about goodness rather than loud about it. That he had made their daughter visible only in the exact ways that safety requires. Evelyn slid the resident witness page toward the middle and set a pen beside it, perpendicular, not a suggestion but a placement. Her eyes said later. Her posture said we will not be hurried. Amira reached for the small envelope Grant had left with her name on it last night. It had remained unopened in the hush of grown-up paper. Their hands had been full of the big pieces. Now the small one waited like a pebble at the bottom of a stream that changes the water above it without asking. Inside, a card not much larger than her palm and a folded page with only a few lines. The card had a time and a place, tomorrow, 4:30 p.m., Community Center, Room 2. The page had something almost like a diary entry, written not to the world but to a single reader. When I was your age, I waited at a fence too. If you come tomorrow, you won't be asked to speak unless you want to. I'll ask you one question and sit very still while your answer costs me what it costs. G. The room measured that sentence and found itself different by an inch in every direction. The rest of the morning moved in ordinary ways to keep fear from becoming decoration. Dishes washed. A floor swept. Micah's meds lined in a row. The direct line card tucked into the drawer where emergency numbers live. Every so often, eyes returned to the folder to confirm it hadn't been a trick of fatigue or hope, and every time the paper remained, heavy, indifferent, real. By afternoon the neighborhood had already tested the new chains into friendship. The room carried their distant laughter through the thin windows, the kind that sounds like water over stones. Amira sat at the table with a pencil and a blank sheet and tried to write gratitude without writing a thank you note, because this didn't feel like a gift, it felt like something put back where it belonged. She drew the slide instead. Then a small square with a triangle roof and an arrow at the window, me. Then a second square she hadn't drawn before, room 2. Evening edged in with its narrow gold and its long shadows. The folder had been returned to its place in the center, closed but not hidden, like a family Bible that could be reached easily if someone needed a verse at midnight. The 2 mugs had gone cold and been replaced and gone cold again. That was when the hallway gave them a new sound. Not Grant's knock. Not the deliberate wait that had opened this chapter of their lives. A lighter rhythm, 3 taps in a row as if someone had practiced being gentle. Evelyn glanced at Tasha, Tasha lifted her chin, Amira held Micah's hand like a promise she could keep on her own. The door opened on the chain. A young woman stood in the frame with wind-tangled hair and a messenger bag crossing her chest. She wore no uniform but carried familiarity the way some people carry smell, immediate, undeniable. In her hands, another envelope with the same dark crest impressed on wax, and a badge tucked half out of a pocket that read Operations/Site. "I'm here for the sign-off," she said softly, voice respectful to doorways. "And to answer questions not fit for email." Tasha looked to the table where the resident witness line waited. Evelyn's hand found the pen again and didn't move it, only rested there like a small weight. The woman lifted the envelope, hesitated, then offered something else instead, a small, worn photograph from her own bag, 2 figures at a fence in a different year. "Sometimes," she said, "these programs begin with paper." This one didn't. The apartment shifted again, as if the floor had leaned toward a choice. And the folder between them felt heavier and somehow easier to lift. The liaison didn't leave when her questions were finished. She stayed, leaning against the narrow kitchen wall as though she'd measured the apartment by heartbeats instead of square feet. Her messenger bag remained slung across her shoulder, but the way her hand tapped lightly on the flap made it feel less like luggage and more like a reminder, she carried things inside that could rattle if pressed. Evelyn was the first to speak, her voice carrying the edge of someone who had spent years teaching silence how to protect her. "Why come here in person? You had us read the folder. You got your papers ready for a signature. Why stand in our kitchen instead of letting that be enough?" The young woman didn't flinch. "Because the folder is only half the truth. The part the company approved. But I work inside long enough to know that when a promise looks this clean, there are always hands trying to smudge it." Tasha's mouth tightened. "So you're saying we've been set up?" "Not set up," the liaison corrected softly. "Tested. Watched." Amira sat very still, Micah asleep against her shoulder. The words carried weight she didn't have to be grown to understand. If you've ever felt eyes on your family when you least expected it, subscribe now. Because sometimes the walls listening are thicker than the ones around your home. The liaison opened her bag finally, sliding out a single folded sheet. No corporate header. No city stamp. Just plain paper, creased down the middle. "These are notes from a meeting I wasn't supposed to be in," she said. Certain board members want to bury this project before it grows legs. To them, fixing a playground isn't business. It's exposure. They think Mr. Whitaker's sympathy makes him reckless. Evelyn's hand gripped her cane tighter, the wood creaking. And where does that leave us? The liaison's eyes shifted to Amira. It leaves her at the center. Her letter is the record. It's why he moved ahead without waiting for consensus. That means she's the proof they'll try to dismiss or protect, depending on whose vote carries next quarter. The room chilled. Tasha whispered, "She's 7. She can't be their battlefield." But Amira was already imagining room 2, the community center she'd drawn on paper yesterday. A small square with a triangle roof. Now the square felt enormous, stretching taller than buildings she'd ever passed. She pictured chairs lined in rows, the smell of floor polish, the hum of lights overhead. And somewhere inside, a seat with her name invisible but waiting. The liaison's voice gentled. "Tomorrow at 4:30, there will be people in that room who want to hear her. Not reporters. Not cameras. The ones who carry votes. They need to see she exists, because right now she's only a name on his folder. She doesn't have to speak unless she chooses. But being there, sitting in that chair, makes his promise harder to erase." Tasha moved closer to Evelyn, whispering too low for Amira to catch. Evelyn shook her head once, then twice. Their debate happened in glances, danger weighed against opportunity, trust against betrayal. Amira touched the envelope still sitting unopened at the table's edge. She had written once and been heard. The thought of writing with her presence instead of a pencil frightened her more than pages of adult contracts. That night, the apartment felt smaller. Dinner passed in near silence. Micah slept quickly, exhaustion claiming him after a day of chasing new swings. Evelyn washed plates with deliberate force, each clang louder than the last. Tasha paced between rooms, pausing at the window whenever headlights flickered outside. Amira sat on her bed drawing again, but the square marked room 2 filled the whole page this time. She shaded it darker, then pressed the pencil until the tip snapped. Sleep carried her only halfway to morning. In her dreams, she sat in the community center surrounded by empty chairs. The folder lay on the floor, pages fluttering in a breeze that came from nowhere. When she bent to pick it up, the papers dissolved like ash, leaving only her letter, the one she'd written first, burning without smoke. She woke before dawn, breath sharp, clutching her blanket. By mid-morning, Evelyn called her to the table. The resident witness line still waited for ink. The pen lay across it like a question no one wanted to answer. Evelyn's hands trembled, but her eyes were steady. "Child," she said, "we don't sign for nothing we don't understand. But tomorrow, maybe you'll sit in a place where their eyes can't pretend you don't matter." Tasha added, softer, "We can't promise what happens after. But we can promise not to hide." Amira nodded, though her stomach churned. The day passed slowly, each hour wearing the weight of what tomorrow would bring. Neighbors filtered by, whispering thanks for the repairs, dropping off bread, leaving smiles meant for Amira though no one said her name out loud. She felt taller and smaller all at once, her shoulders carrying both pride and fear. Evening brought the hum of an engine outside. Amira froze at the window. The black car had returned, headlights cutting across the street. It idled there, the sound filling every corner of their small apartment. This time, the rear door opened. Not a worker, not a messenger. The driver stepped out, crisp in his dark jacket, face unreadable. He didn't walk to the door with papers. He stood at the curb, looking up at their window until Tasha drew the curtain closed. Then his voice cut across the quiet. "Room 2 is expecting you." The words weren't shouted, but they traveled like a summons anyway. If you believe a child's voice can turn silence into change, subscribe now. Because what happens in that room tomorrow could shift more than chains and slides. The car didn't leave immediately. Its headlights painted pale stripes on their wall, a reminder that decisions didn't wait forever. Amira sat with Micah asleep beside her, her hand clutching the drawing she'd made of room 2. For the first time, she realized she wasn't afraid of the seat waiting for her. She was afraid of what might happen if she left it empty. The engine finally dimmed. The night folded in around them, heavy with the echo of words still hanging in the air. "Room 2 is expecting you." The community center smelled faintly of bleach and floor polish, the kind of scent that hides behind fluorescent light. Its corridors hummed with the echo of footsteps and whispered questions. Evelyn's cane tapped softly against the tiles. Tasha held Micah's hand, guiding him with quiet urgency. Amira walked between them, clutching the folded drawing she had made the night before, room 2 sketched in pencil, a box darker than the rest of the page. Now she was stepping into it. The double doors to room 2 were already open. Inside, rows of chairs faced a table draped in white cloth. Men and women in pressed suits shuffled papers and whispered into phones. Their voices carried the sharp edge of people used to deciding without being questioned. At the far end of the room, Grant Whitaker stood apart. No tie, jacket unbuttoned, eyes fixed not on the board but on the door as Amira entered. The room fell quieter. Not silent, not reverent, but changed, as if a letter written in crooked lines had walked in on 2 small legs. Amira's cheeks burned, though she hadn't spoken. She felt the weight of every gaze pressing against her shoulders. Evelyn guided her to the single chair in front of the long table. Too big for her frame, the seat swallowed her, yet the space around it seemed carved just for her. If you've ever felt the smallest person in the room carried the greatest weight, subscribe now. Because sometimes the one chair no one expects to matter becomes the center of the floor. A man with silver hair cleared his throat. "We are here today to review the Hawthorne Corridor Initiative," he said, voice practiced, smooth as glass. "Certain expenditures have been made. Certain promises, too. The board seeks clarity before additional commitments are authorized." Another woman spoke up, her tone clipped. Mr. Whitaker acted without full approval. "The repairs you've seen are admirable, yes, but expansion requires accountability. This is not how business is conducted." Grant's voice cut through, low and steady. "This isn't business. It's correction. A child had to remind us what our ledgers forget." The board shifted uneasily. Their eyes slid toward Amira. No one asked her to speak, not yet. But her presence burned into the silence between sentences. A younger man at the table leaned forward. "The girl wrote a letter." "Fine. But sentiment doesn't balance books. What we need is assurance this won't become precedent, that we won't have 100 more letters forcing us into projects that bring no return." Grant turned to Amira then, for the first time since she entered. His eyes carried none of the sharpness he reserved for colleagues. He bent slightly, as if lowering himself to her height without moving from his place. His question traveled across the space gently, but everyone heard it. "Did you believe your letter would be read?" Amira's throat tightened. She gripped the drawing in her lap, its edges damp from her hands. The room swayed in silence, waiting. She remembered Micah's cough, the cracked slide, Evelyn's prayers whispered at night. She remembered writing in pencil that smudged too easily, hoping paper could reach where her voice never had. Her answer came small but clear. I hoped. She paused, then lifted her chin. Because if nobody read it, the slide would stay broken. And my brother would keep waiting. No one moved for a long moment. The words were too simple to argue with, too raw to dismiss. The suits at the table glanced at one another, searching for language their degrees hadn't taught them. If you've ever known that a child's truth can silence a boardroom faster than money ever could, subscribe now. Because this moment proves words written in hope can outweigh any ledger. Grant nodded once, as though she'd given the only testimony that mattered. He faced the table again. You have your clarity. She hoped. I acted. And if hope is what frightens this board, then maybe it's time to reconsider who belongs at this table. The silver-haired man shifted uncomfortably, then gestured to his colleagues. A hushed vote passed along the line, papers rustling like dry leaves. Words were exchanged quickly: approve continuation, limited scope, oversight required. In the end, hands rose. More in favor than against. The initiative survived. Not unanimously. But enough. The chair under Amira felt steadier now, though her legs still dangled above the polished floor. She didn't smile. She simply exhaled, the kind of release that carries weeks of waiting inside it. Grant closed the folder in front of him. His gaze flicked toward her once more before he left the room through a side door, his shoulders squared as if the vote had carved new weight onto them. The suits gathered their papers, voices rising again, no longer silenced but careful, cautious. Evelyn touched Amira's shoulder, guiding her to stand. Tasha lifted Micah into her arms. Together, they stepped out of room 2, the echo of their footsteps softer than the ones that had filled the corridor earlier. At the doorway, Amira turned back. The chair she'd occupied looked ordinary again, an empty seat among many. Yet she knew it wasn't. It had been the axis of the room. For a moment, she had carried a project, a promise, and the gaze of people who believed themselves untouchable. All because she wrote in crooked lines and believed someone might listen. Outside, the sun dipped low, staining the community center windows with orange. Children's laughter floated from the newly repaired playground across the block. Micah wriggled free from Tasha's arms, running ahead toward the sound, his blanket trailing like a banner behind him. Evelyn leaned on her cane, watching. The letter opened the door, she murmured. But stepping through it, that's what changed the room. Amira slipped the drawing of room 2 into her pocket. The square she had shaded so dark no longer frightened her. She had sat in it. She had filled it. And she had left it changed.